Hello, I am Aleksandra Marchewicz. Welcome to The Bottom Line, where we break down the most pressing business and economic issues of the day. Now, the government plans tomorrow to unveil the 2025 budget, and it won't be an easy one. Today, we delve into realities behind the numbers, exploring whether Poland can maintain fiscal discipline among large news outlets. And joining me to discuss this in a moment is Ignacy Morawski, Economist at Puls Biznesu. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Hello. Hello, good afternoon.
So now the 2025 budget seems to be at the intersection of political promises and economic reality. So having that in mind, how do you perceive the balance between maintaining fiscal discipline and fulfilling the political commitments made before recent elections?
Well, I think that the weight is certainly on the side of political commitments. There are no plans for fiscal savings, no plans for tax increases, and neither any spending cuts. So clearly, Poland is heading towards a very unorthodox fiscal policy, right? So we do not have any clear fiscal consolidation plans besides some very general slogans. And it's interesting because at the same day, today, in the UK, we heard Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who said that the upcoming budget will be very painful and difficult. So we have very different perspectives in Poland and in Western European economies. I think that Polish fiscal policy is much more like the US, where the concern for I would say the fiscal balance is very low.
And having that in mind, you mentioned an orthodox policy. Now, Poland has found itself, I feel like, under the excessive deficit procedure, which you mentioned, and recent years have also shown significant expenditures, for instance, with the 14th pension installment and the 5% deficit just last year, really. So how does the government now plan to reconcile the past decision with the current budget economy, to your mind?
Well, the fiscal rules and excessive deficit procedure of the European Union are clearly a challenge for the government. My view is that the government will not meet the fiscal rules of the European Union. So they will remember that no country within the EU has ever paid any penalties or any price for breaching the rules. And famously, I think around 8 years ago, France, when France was breaking the rules for many years, and the European Commission president was asked why France was not penalized, the answer was, well, because France is France. So clearly today, the thinking in Warsaw is that Poland is Poland. The political position of the Polish government within the European Union is stronger than before. So I suppose that at this moment, there is no clear path and no rigid thinking about how to meet the fiscal rules, right? So the most important political goal, are the next year's presidential election. And before those elections, we will not see any fiscal consolidation, spending cuts, or tax increases. And European fiscal rules are on the third or even third position among priorities.
So are you saying that we can see some perhaps subtle or not subtle change after elections in 2025, for instance?
Well, for sure, we will have to see some twists and changes to the fiscal policy, because we are running a deficit between 5 and 6% of GDP. This is not sustainable in the very long term. We can keep this rate for a couple of years, but not for many years. So I suppose that after the elections, the government will try to find some savings, not huge ones. Certainly, Donald Tusk is afraid of the scenario that he went through a decade ago, when fiscal consolidation brought stagnation in real wages and public discontent in Poland. And that was one of many factors that led to that government losing the elections in 2015. So Donald Tusk is very afraid of and wary of fiscal consolidation. He does not want to engage in such policy. He does not want to engage in fiscal austerity. And they count on high GDP growth to reduce the deficit indicators. So if you take the ratio of deficit to GDP, the main, I would say, line of thinking within the government is that we should increase the dynamics of the denominator, the GDP, not decrease the dynamics of numerator, the nominal deficit. So, but nevertheless, after 2025 presidential elections, I suppose that some fiscal cuts might be on the table. It's difficult to imagine what exactly. I suppose that, as in the past, some public wages will be frozen. Maybe some investments will be reduced, or some fiscal transfers will be frozen in real terms, right? So, for example, we have a very large child benefit at around 200 euro per month. And I suppose that this will be frozen in real terms. So it will not be adjusted by inflation indicator. And that will help to achieve some savings in coming years. But this will not be a large fiscal adjustments.
And you mentioned some fiscal cuts that might be made now to reverse that situation, but I wonder, how realistic is it for Poland to reverse the current deficit trend, and what specific measures, you mentioned some of them, but what specific measures will need to be implemented, and what possible now economic and social implications of these measures, really?
As I said, I do not expect any large fiscal measures to be implemented, large fiscal consolidation, like, for example, big cuts in spending or increase in taxes. The thing is that if GDP grows at around 4%, right, so roughly a historical average, maybe a bit above, which is an ambitious scenario, but let's imagine for a while that we have a strong GDP growth, then in such a scenario, it is much easier to run fiscal policy because you do not need, in order to cut the deficit indicators, right, within the context of high GDP growth, you do not need to cut any spending. It's enough to increase spending slower than GDP growth, right? So that was the source of success, I would say, fiscal success of the previous government. They increased nominal spending a lot, but at the same time, the GDP growth was very high, so both debt indicators and deficit indicators stayed very stable. So under the high growth scenario, we will not need the large fiscal consolidation in Poland. And this is the scenario, optimistic.
But can we reverse really the situation? Do you think that we can reverse now the current deficit trend?
You mean, well, in terms of the ratio of deficit to GDP, which is around 5 or 6% of GDP, we can, under the current policy, we can reduce it a bit only under a high GDP growth scenario. This is, I don't expect any real large fiscal consolidation in Poland.
And now I wonder, because now, while Poland's public debt is relatively low compared to some other EU countries, the dynamics of public spending, including energy subsidies that are set to continue, are raising some concerns. So now the International Monetary Fund, and if I may quote some numbers, has projected that Poland's debt might exceed 60% of GDP within 3 years. So having in mind what you just mentioned, now what do you see as the main economic challenge that Poland must address to prevent this scenario from unfolding?
Well, first of all, the scenario of breaching 60% of GDP is nothing scary. Like in most European countries, debt indicators are much higher. So I think we should not be too much tight to this limit of 60% of GDP. Obviously, Poland is a different country, right? So we have a smaller banking sector, smaller financial sector, so it is more difficult to finance deficit in Poland than in developed countries. But still, we have relatively low debt indicators. Even if we breach 60% of GDP, even in this scenario, we will still have much lower debt indicators than most countries of the European Union. So I think we do not face any fiscal crisis or huge fiscal challenges. However, as I said, we are not as developed country. We do not have as well-grown financial sector as Western European economies. So certainly we have to pay more attention to debt indicators than developed countries. And having said this, I have to admit that fiscal policy will be a challenge, right? So one scenario is that we have a high GDP growth, and in this scenario, we can sort of keep the fiscal policy at the current stance. We do not have to introduce any large savings programs. Now, if we assume another scenario, lower growth, so let's assume that GDP growth is 1 or 2%, which is pretty pessimistic, but everything is possible. So under low growth scenario, fiscal policy will be much more challenging, right? Because it will be more difficult to adjust spending and tax indicators. Social problems will grow. So under the low growth scenario, I expect fiscal strains to be much higher and political conflicts due to those strains to be much stronger, and fiscal policy becoming, in general, much more challenging. So the main point here is that everything depends on GDP growth. That's my point, that's my view, that GDP growth is the most important indicator for a country like Poland. If we grow fast, then deficit is not a problem.
So
we will
hopefully, and like you mentioned, that we do see numbers, so hopefully we'll do see, these numbers matching the projections that you just outlined for us here on TVP World. So thank you so much for joining us. And that was Ignacy Morawski, economist at Puls Biznesu. So now that's the bottom line for today. And remember that in the world of business, the bottom line is the only line that counts. Alexandra Marchewicz signing off. Goodbye.